So my very first memory of school was crying and holding on to my mother for dear life at the gates of hell, also known as pre-kindergarten. My face was red and I was crying and sobbing because, like most children, I didn't want to go to school. The fear wasn't simply derived from the fact that I didn't want to leave my mother's side. Trust me, I'd already done that plenty of times before I learned to walk. It was the thought of something unknown and unfamiliar that truly frightened me. For me, school had initially just been a test of my endurance until I could get home and play video games or watch television. Of course, that was accountable to my lack of maturity, obviously. However, as I grew older, like everyone else, I noticed that school had become a much bigger part of my life than I had expected. Before I knew it, I was face to face with my first standardized test in the 3rd grade, the ELA. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the ELA, it's a standardized, state-administered English language arts exam that every student must take between the grades of 3 and 8. This test is graded on a scale of 1 to 4, 1 being the lowest and 4 being the highest, and getting below 2 supposedly meant that you were not on track according to the state. So coming face to face with my first standardized test proved to be quite the interesting experience for me. After spending the entire year supposedly preparing for this one test, I was still not really feeling prepared to take it. As the proctor handed out the test booklets and answer sheets, I quickly began rummaging through them, filling out whatever I could. Possibly the worst decision I could ever have made. The proctor for my exam was my language arts teacher, whose name will not be mentioned, but who was a stubborn lady who was always seen chewing on some hard candy with a lazy eye that always seemed to stare at you. She quickly reprimanded me in my inability to follow directions by going ahead of the class, and that's where the problem started. So I opened my test booklet when she says, "Go," and flip open to the first question on the page. The passage looked huge. And of course, it was at that moment when my brain decided to forget all the skills and strategies we'd learned for taking this test. When trying to read the first passage, engrossed in my panic state of mind, my stomach began to hurt. I'd eaten a bagel with butter the morning of. It was a deviation from my usual breakfast, and I was already really anxious because of the test. And as I was reading the passage, my stomach began to hurt more and more. I realized I had to go. And I had to go badly. So, obviously, I raised my hand like a polite student and asked if I could use the restroom. My proctor, predictably, said no. After stating that it was an emergency, her response was that the only emergency I had was the test in front of me. So, I continued with the test, totally forgetting the panic and stress that it caused me now that I had been preoccupied with some more urgent matters. No more was this test my enemy, but rather my body was. By the time the test was over, it was too late. The deed had been done. I was unable to hold it in any longer. Needless to say, my standardized test-taking skills haven't really improved much since then. But really, what's the point of this? Well, for one, I wanted to know how easy it was for me to become preoccupied with my own problems and bodily functions that I completely forgot about the stress that test had caused me. However, my proctor failed to recognize my priorities, a mistake she later came to regret. She was more focused on getting her job done than actually worrying about anything other than me taking the test. She was worried about jeopardizing her role in what I call the education business. This business of education has become directly linked to the world of economics and enabled the profession of teaching to become inherently political. Ever since the 1983 release of A Nation at Risk by the National Commission on Excellence in Education, national economic competitiveness has been offered as a primary reason for pushing school reform. Responding to these urgent words, the National Governors Association in 1989 pledged that US students would lead the world in math and science achievement by the year 2000. Look where we are now. That wasn't the case. The common sense theory is that countries must have good schools to succeed economically. Therefore, the only measure of this qualitative variable of good schools is the performance of students on tests, because that tests apparently the average level of cognitive skills. However, economists have conducted several studies that have led to the conclusion that there is, in fact, an association between economic growth and higher levels of cognitive thinking. This, in turn, begs the question, If that's the case, then why in the world has the US GDP growth rate been higher than ever before in the last century, but its cognitive thinking skills have still been average compared to other countries? It was then that I realized that part of the answer is that the United States may be resting on its historic record as the world's leader in educational attainment. In addition, the US has other advantages, some of which are entirely separate and apart from the quality of its schooling. The US maintains generally freer labor and product markets than most countries in the world, and there is less government regulation of firms, and trade unions are less powerful than in many other countries. Put more broadly, the US has generally less intrusion of government in the operation of the economy, including lower tax rates and minimal government production through nationalized industries. Taken together, these characteristics of the US economy encourage investment, permit the rapid development of new products and activities by firms, and allow US workers to adjust to new opportunities. However, it's also the case that over the 20th century, the expansion of the US education system outpaced the rest of the world. The US pushed to open secondary schools to all citizens, higher education expanded with the development of land-grant universities, the GI Bill, and direct grants and loans to students. The extraordinary US higher education system is a powerful engine of technological progress and economic growth in the US. By most evaluations, US colleges and universities rank at the very top of the world. As a result, the political sphere involves itself so that the reforms being passed as a result of the economic sphere are favorable to certain political interest groups. No more is a teacher simply teaching, but now facing the challenge of meeting the demands of all these different political interest groups, as well as trying to improve the cognitive thinking skills of students just to boost the national economy. In the past decade, the very idea of what it means to be a teacher has completely changed. Education has become a business now, as it's trying to create products in the system. Products like you, and you, and you and me. Students that can possibly achieve higher test scores to prove that higher cognitive thinking skills are directly correlated with a better economy. Students that satisfy the political needs of various interest groups to in turn stimulate the economic benefits. In essence, education has become the driving force in both politics as well as economics. Education has derived itself from an economic need to success, and thus the need for educational success has led for political interest groups to become greedier, to become more actively involved in education, thus taking away from what education is really about. It's not about tests. Education is it should no longer be about what we do on paper. It should be about what we learn. Taking these tests and pooping your pants in the middle of it is not a test to see how good you are. That doesn't test anything other than whether or not you can not poop during a test. I have never had that situation happen to me ever again, of course, but that teacher was trained to not let me go to the bathroom. Her priority was that she should let me take the test, and that I should be the one to hold my poop. So I ask you this one question. If education is now more based on politics and driven by the forces of the economy, and a need for economic success in the nation, a need for economic success by countries to prove that they're better than each other, then why are we just taking tests? There are better ways to see if we are better than other countries. There are other ways to gauge competition. The reason derives itself in human nature. Human nature has a desire for what I believe power. And thus, this desire for power leads to possibly a corruption in the inspiration that we should have. The inspiration that should lead us to create, not destroy. The inspiration that should lead us to enjoy taking these tests, to enjoy learning, not for the sake of taking tests, to enjoy learning for the sake of just learning, of filling yourself with knowledge of things that you want to learn about, things that you want to become interested in. And that's what education is all about. Education has become a business. And as a wise man once told me, he who controls education controls the future. Thank you.